A schizophrenic inmate of an asylum enters a room in a country. In goes to bed and can only be removed by force, for he expects the Queen of Holland, who wishes to marry him, to arrive at any moment. He is a little ungainly creature who never in all his life has known any but the most miserable surroundings. He is without a single advantage of mind, body or estate. It is impossible that the Queen of Holland should know anything of this poor patient in Switzerland, and if she did, he certainly would be the last man she could wish to marry. Neither the patient nor his intended bride has taken any of the preliminary steps necessary for a wedding. Neither for the civil ceremony nor for the celebration of the day itself is anything prepared. But all that does not prevent our patient from intending to become prince consort upon that day. The thinking of this patient, which represents a very common type, appears to be sheer nonsense. He imagines something absolutely impossible, and what is more, he believes it to be reality. Its contradictions to reality do not exist for him. If, however, we don't touch these things, the patient seems to be quite reasonable. He works all the week like a healthy man and goes for a walk on Sundays like ordinary people. Here, he thinks rightly and reckons with reality as it is. His thinking, therefore, is not disturbed in all directions. Moreover, there is method in his madness. To marry a princess would naturally be the height of human happiness to any poor, unfortunate devil. Our fairy tales testify to this. And it is just a fairy tale with which our friend has to do, only after a somewhat different fashion than with us rational mortals. He does not tell a fairy tale, he does not read one, he lives his fairy tale. Let us hold this in our minds, and it will at once bring the abnormal man nearer to us healthy ones. Each of us has also his fairy tale. He does not indeed usually believe himself to live it. Only when he is quite alone and his thoughts are let loose does it come to light. The man is then rich, attractive, healthy and handsome. He always chooses those advantages in which he is most hopelessly lacking. Directly reality regains its sway, the plaything will be thrust hastily back into the cupboard, where it is hidden not only from strangers but from the owner himself, for once outside the dream he is not at all aware how far he can really identify himself with its characters. But perhaps I have said too much. The cupboard into which the toy is put is in our own brain, and it never shuts tight. Without our noticing it, the imprisoned fairy very often stretches out a hand. She guides our taste in the choice of a tie. She guides our hand when we make the flourish to our signature. By our bearing, our voice, the choice of our phraseology, she shows the expert the trend of our aspirations. We stand, therefore, far nearer than would have at first sight appeared to the lunatic, whose vagrant thought struck us just now so forcibly. At any rate, the difference is only a relative one. And when we look more closely, we find amongst all normal people many and important instances where thought is divorced both from logic and from reality. I have called those forms of thinking autistic, corresponding to the idea of schizophrenic autismus, which, turning away from reality, sees life in fantastic pictures and is founded precisely upon autistic thinking. Psychology, until quite lately, had only studied the logical laws of thinking. Just recently, Le Bon, Freud and Jung began simultaneously with myself to direct attention to the autistic form. The knowledge of this kind of thinking is a necessary foundation for the understanding of morbid formations. Moreover, there are important parts of the normal psyche that it is impossible to understand without a knowledge of the autistic laws. These alone throw light upon the important but hitherto almost ignored inner life of the individual, upon the influences which shape the creations of the poets, and upon those which impel the peoples in the formation of their views of custom and religion and in their dealing with home and foreign politics. The nearer the abnormal come to us normal and the better we understand them, so much the more successfully can we deal with them. And even if we cannot cure many psychoses as we heal a broken bone, yet we can discharge an increasing number of them so much improved in health that they are quite capable of living in the society of men and of earning their living. And what must guide us therein is not the diagnoses and the systematical conception of individual diseases, but their psychological mechanisms, as Adolf Meyer has shown in his very clever pamphlet. In many sorts of illness, it is quite indifferent how we describe and classify, if we can only understand and help the patient. I am pleased to speak about these things before an American audience because in this country psychology is free from the prejudices of the old continent and has in so many regards left behind our sometimes medieval conceptions. A child plays in the bath with the floating thermometer. He pulls it to and fro pretending that it is a boat. He himself travels on it. Then he makes big waves which sink the boat. Now the thermometer is the little fellow himself who has fallen into the water and sunk, and immediately afterwards it comes up as a big fish that is going to swallow the boy, and is at the same time the stick with which the fish is driven away. At other times the child imagines himself to be a father, a mother, a general, and he acts accordingly, although with the most inadequate material and with the situations not at all corresponding to that which he wishes to represent. Here he ignores reality in a high degree. He only uses just so much of it as is necessary for the part he is playing. The thermometer is there in reality. He uses it in reality, not as a thermometer, however, but in a multitude of characters which he imposes upon it. Thus he effaces the difference between reality and fantasy. If a stick that represents an animal is broken, the child has real sympathy with the animal and is in earnest when he tries to console it. Like the child who wishes himself grown up and grand, the poet, at least the true poet, transforms his unhappy love into a happy one, or glorifies it in such a way that it appears to him tragically beautiful and sublime. His hero always contains a piece of his own soul, and when he lets him perish, he is the personification of one of the tendencies which the poet would wish to overcome in his own life, or one that has stained his conscience with guilt. The death of his hero atones for the poet's own crime. Goethe punishes himself in Clavigo and Weislingen for having deserted Friederike Bryan. Schiller realized his ambitions in The Brothers Moore, in Fiesco, in Wallenstein, and showed himself to what end they must inevitably lead. In poetry, certain real affective needs of the poet are alive, and his characters have an additional reality for him in that he takes as vital an interest in them as in actual human beings. His friends found the poet Kleist, who had just drawn the dying scene of Penthesilea, dissolved in tears. Poetry is closely related to mythology, and between the two stands legendary lore, the formation of which is naturally a very complicated one. We know that there are not real personalities behind all the heroes of the sagas. The German Siegfried and the Jewish Samson are really sun gods, but what later generations have made out of them are beings with the human ideals, the virtues and the vices of those who created them. The greater part of mythology is really symbolism. The times of the year and day, the forces of nature, the fructifying and the scorching power of the sun, the animal procreative power and similar things are represented as human characters and actions. The process is, even more than in the poet, an unconscious one. The myths are understood literally. The sun god drives his chariot across the heavens, and the Greek goddess of wisdom is born from the head of the god of heaven. These conceptions are divorced from reality in a high degree. There are chariots, it is true, but we have no reason to suppose that they drive across heaven. Of course, children are born, but never out of the head of a man. All these are examples of a form of thinking that acts independently both of logic and of reality. If there is not so sharp a contrast with realistic thinking in the play of the child and in poetry, that in mythology is a much more direct and brutal one, and from the logical point of view, these products, with all their wonderful poetry, are sheer nonsense. In like manner, we see in representations of the universe how the earth is supported by an elephant which stands on a huge tortoise, the tortoise on a snake, and so on ad infinitum. We see the same in these conceptions which answer to our desires to control destiny. With magic and sacrifice and prayer, men will try to divert all evil and to attract all good. Neither nature nor experience give us any ground for believing these things, except insofar as we ignore many causal connections between the events and can therefore assume them where we see none. But to assume such things as magic and witchcraft, we have no logical ground whatsoever. How great the gap is between autistic and logical or realistic thinking will be clear to us when we realize what logical thinking really is. Firstly, it represents occurrences in the outer world and their associations. We have often heard thunder following lightning. Therefore, whenever we see lightning, we expect thunder, and when we hear thunder, we take it for granted that it has lightened. We see regular fixed results follow our own actions. We associate the two, and when we desire a particular result, we call to mind the actions by which it will be attained. These examples will perhaps suffice to indicate that in logical thinking, we reproduce reality. To fit ourselves to new situations, we must be able to create new combinations of the conceptions of experience. So far as these correspond with reality, they show us new ways of action, whether it is a question of buying a pair of shoes or of steering an airplane. If they deviate from reality, they pass over into autistic thinking. Our human understanding can never compass everything. We can therefore draw no hard and fast line between the two forms of thinking. But the more knowledge we possess, the greater will be the possibility of logical thinking. We moderns believe ourselves to be justified in our assumption that the Earth moves round the Sun, and that the Sun himself is a mass of glowing gases. There is no longer any place in our mind for Apollo's chariot. As a rule, the symbolism of the normal individual replaces conceptions which are difficult to represent and to conceive of, or against which there is a resistance. Especially we like to replace abstract by concrete ideas. The whole railway system will be represented by a wheel with wings. A serpent will represent sin. In dreams and in morbid conditions, these symbols will not only be used more frequently, but they will be extended to embrace even easily representable things. A room, for example, may represent a woman. This can go so far that father and mother are interchanged in the patient's mind. A schizophrenic may conceive a hatred against his father because he is jealous of him on his mother's account, and then put his mother in his place and want to kill her in his father's place. A father as patient may confound himself in his letters with the mother of his children. It strikes us at first sight as absolute nonsense when a patient maintains that she is Switzerland and the cranes of Ibycus. Upon closer observation, we see the sense in her assertion. The patient is confined in an asylum, deprived of her liberty. She yearns for liberty. Switzerland is a republic, a free country. She also wants to be free. That is the first meaning of her expression, I am Switzerland, but to her it means still more. She takes the thing also literally and is Switzerland, Helvetia herself, who is engraved on our coins. Switzerland even belongs to her. She quite means all this in the literal sense. We see here how, in autistic thinking, the conceptions dissociate themselves and one is put in the place of the other. She is moreover the cranes of Ibycus, that is, she has frei von Schuld und Fehle, bevort die kindlich reine Seele, kept free from guilt and failings, and pure her childlike soul, as Schiller says in his poem entitled The Cranes of Ibycus. Thus nonsense becomes sense. A particular form of autistic idea disturbance is the systematic shifting of sexual conceptions to other parts of the body, more especially upwards. A normal 2-year-old child has been known to ask his pregnant mother, "Why have you such a big head?" It should be stated that this child knew well what the alteration in his mother's figure meant. Many primitive genital hallucinations are transferred later to other parts of the body, and in the fairy tale, as in the crazy ideas of the schizophrenic, many a child is born from the mouth. In some instances, the poisoning delusion of women originates from their desire for offspring. They believe, as in fairy tales, that they will become pregnant from the food they are given, and some supposed admixture with the food is symbolized as poison. In the autistic thinking, the grossest contradictions may exist, side by side, and these contradictions may be within the thought itself as well as contradictions of the representations with the outer world. Just as the child may be little Jack, and at the same time the great general, the insane man may be John Brown, but at the same time God Almighty, and often in addition the Pope or the Emperor. The physician who visits the patient is the physician, but he is also the clergyman, Mr. Robinson and then Major Smith, and the patient is quite aware of all this. Whilst the playing child never loses a certain feeling that he himself puts something into the things, to the deranged these ideas correspond to reality. But so long as the insane are composed in their thinking, they are partly conscious of the contradictions with what sound people call reality. The possessor of delusional millions gets nothing out of them but the feeling of being rich. As soon as he wants to enjoy his riches, they escape him. To an insane workman, the delusions promise a promotion in his position, which of course does not happen. So long as the man has a need of causal connections, he must seek an explanation for such a contradiction.